The dress was the first problem. Mira's gowns were made for a woman who had never done anything with her hands that left marks on them, and Lyra's hands had been leaving marks on themselves since she was 12 years old. The small burn scar on her right index finger from the first time she'd worked with heated instruments, the calluses across her palm from years of grinding compounds, the particular roughness of knuckles that had been washed in medicinal solution so many times the skin had simply given up, trying to be soft. She stood in Mira's chamber in the blue traveling gown with its fitted sleeves and its careful embroidery, and looked at her own hands emerging from the cuffs and thought, these are not a noble's daughter's hands. She would have to keep them still, keep them folded, keep them from doing the things they did automatically, but the reaching and the assessing, and the work that her body defaulted to without consulting her mind first. She had 3 days to learn to be someone else. Mira sat on the edge of her bed and watched Lyra with the expression of a woman balanced between profound relief and profound guilt. Both of them real, neither of them winning. She had stopped crying an hour ago and moved into the practical phase, which Lyra found easier to work with. His name is Aldrich, Mira said. He's a merchant's son from the northern quarter, and father would never— She stopped. You know what father would do? I know, Lyra said. She has been sending letters for 2 years through the lower market courier, and Lyra had known about it and said nothing, because Mira's happiness was a thing she had always protected by instinct. The older sibling habit of absorbing consequences, so the younger one didn't have to. The irony that she was now the younger one doing the absorbing was not lost on her, and she set it aside. You look enough like me, Mira said, from a distance, and they've never seen either of us in person, just the formal portrait father sent. The formal portrait was 5 years old and had been painted by someone with a generous interpretation of the family's cheekbones. Lyra had seen it. She looked enough like it to pass. You know the words, Mira said. The tribute presentation. The formal address, I memorized them this morning, Lyra said. Mira was quiet for a moment, then, I'm sorry. Her voice broke on it slightly. I know you had plans. I know you were going to— I didn't have plans, Lyra said, which was true. She had had a practice. Barely a practice. The unofficial work, the people the court healers didn't reach, the back rooms and the kitchen tables and the payment in vegetables, and occasionally goats. She had had a purpose which was different from a plan, and the purpose could be relocated. She looked at her hands in the blue sleeves. In Sarathi, there was nothing left for her. The credentials gone, the reputation gone, the 2 years of slow rebuilding never quite reaching the level of something that could be called a life. The prince was dead, and the head physician was still in his position, and the king still believed him, and the truth she had told at such cost was still sitting in a court record labeled dangerous falsehoods, and she had been 22 years old and certain, and it had changed nothing. She could be certain somewhere else. The mountain pass took 4 days by carriage, which gave Lyra 4 days to practice being Mira in the privacy of the carriage's interior, which meant practicing on Sepha, Mira's personal maid, who had agreed to come because she was loyal to Mira, and because Lyra had told her the truth, and she had decided the truth was worth protecting. Sepha was 20 years old and pragmatic in the way of someone who had grown up understanding that the world was what it was, and your options were to manage it or be managed by it. She drilled Lyra on Mira's history, her interests, her education, her friends, and the specific texture of her noble's daughter existence, with the efficiency of someone who had been watching Mira for 3 years and had strong opinions about what to emphasize. You gesture too much when you talk, Sifa said on the 2nd day. Mira is stillness. She lets things come to her. Lyra thought about this. She had spent her working life going to things, moving toward the injury, toward the patient, toward the problem. Stillness was a different orientation. She practiced it. She sat with her hands folded and let the carriage sway around her and breathed in Mira's way, which she had studied since childhood. The deep, even breath of a woman who had never had a reason to be urgent. She was adequate at it by the fourth day. Not good. Adequate. The pass crested on the morning of the fourth day, and the Dragon Emperor's territory opened below them, and Lyra stopped practicing and simply looked. She had expected something harsh. The stories told in Sarathi about the Empire were the stories of a place built for a being who was not human, where the architecture was scaled wrong and the colors were wrong, and everything had the quality of somewhere that tolerated human presence without being designed for it. The stories were not entirely wrong, but they were not right either. What she saw from the pass was vast and strange and beautiful in the specific way of things that did not require your approval. A territory of dark mountains and deep forest, and, in the valleys, cities that caught the morning light at angles that made them look as though they were made of something that was not quite stone. The light was different here. She noticed that immediately, warmer in tone than Sarathi's pale northern light. Amber at the edges even at mid-morning, as though the air itself was slightly altered. She sat back against the carriage seat and resumed her folded hands, and thought, whatever happens here, it is different. Different was something she could work with. The court was inside the largest structure she had ever entered. Not a palace in the Sarathi sense. She had grown up adjacent to Sarathi's royal court and knew its architecture, the human-scaled grandeur of it, the proportions designed to impress other humans. This was different. The ceilings were high enough that the upper reaches were in a different quality of light than the floor level. A soft, amber dimness that suggested the space went further than the eye could confirm. The stone was dark and warm-toned, and the floors were polished to a depth that made them look less like surface and more like the top layer of something that continued downward. Everything was exactly the right size, and the right size was larger than anything she had been built to expect. The court members who assembled for the tribute arrival were human, mostly. The Empire's human administrators and officials, arranged in formal lines with the careful expressions of people performing a ceremony they had performed before. She could see Cressian immediately, a lean man in his 50s, silver-haired, wearing the dark, structured coat of a senior court official, while standing at the front of the receiving line with the posture of a man who had organized this arrival and intended to oversee it precisely. He looked at her when she entered. She had expected the assessment, the measuring look of a man checking what arrived against what was promised. She had prepared for it, had calibrated Mira's stillness and Mira's grace and the particular quality of noble composure she had been practicing for 4 days. She met his look with it, and something in his expression shifted, not visibly. She had spent years reading the micro-expressions of patients who were frightened and hiding it, and she knew how to read the adjustments that happened beneath the surface of controlled faces. What she saw in Cressian's face was a very small, very contained recalibration, the expression of a man noting a discrepancy and filing it for later examination. She held Mira's composure and walked the length of the receiving line, and said the formal words to the officials she was introduced to, and felt Cressian's attention on her back, like a hand between her shoulder blades. Then the quality of the room changed. She had felt Calder's presence in Ashfen through the crowd's reorientation, Darek's through the shift in noise frequency. This was different, not a social shift, but something more fundamental, like a change in pressure. Like the air before a storm when every living thing registered the electricity before the lightning arrived. She felt it move through her from the feet up, the particular full-body alertness of something her body understood before her mind translated it. She turned with the rest of the Rukum. Sorath came through the far doors. He appeared to be in his mid-30s. She knew he was not. 200 years lived behind the amber eyes, and she could see it. Not in lines or age, he had none of either, but in the quality of his stillness. She had seen that quality in very old healers sometimes, the ones who had attended enough deaths that urgency had become a thing they kept in a different compartment from presence. He was still in that way, not passively, not lazily. The stillness of something that had decided what required its energy and was conserving everything else. He was tall, black-haired, wearing dark clothes with the same quality as the court's architecture, exactly the right size. And the right size was significant. His face was, she searched for the word, and found that the words she knew were built for human faces, and this face used similar materials to different effect. Strong-featured, clean-lined, with the amber eyes that caught the court's warm light and held it differently than any eyes she had seen. He moved through the formal receiving with the patience of a being for whom this particular ritual was simply one of an uncountable number of rituals, and he was present for it, without being engaged by it. Until he reached her. She said the tribute presentation words. She had memorized them from Mira's briefing, the specific formal address for a tribute bride presenting to the Dragon Emperor, the old Sarathi, phrasing that had not been updated in 3 generations. She said them correctly, an inflection and cadence as practiced, Mira's stillness in her hands, Mira's composure in her face. The amber eyes were on her throughout. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with the quality of attention that her body registered before her mind did, the same way it had registered the pressure change when he entered the room. Then he said, in a voice that was low and even and had no performance in it whatsoever, "Welcome to the court." 4 words. The formal response. She should have felt relieved. She did not feel relieved. She felt the specific unease of someone who had just been looked at very carefully by something very old and very perceptive, and had not yet received the verdict. Behind him, Crescian made a small note in the record book he carried. The receiving line moved on. Lyra kept her hands folded and her face composed, and breathed in Mira's way, the deep, even breath of a woman who had never had a reason to be urgent. To her left, 3 steps up on the ceremonial dais, a young court servant was carrying a ceremonial torch bracket to its mounting position on the wall. She registered him with the peripheral awareness she had developed over years of working in crowded treatment rooms, the particular awareness of bodies in space, the assessment of how they were moving, and whether the movement was right. It was not right. He was favoring his left side, which meant his right hand had less grip than the task required, which meant the bracket, heavier than it appeared from the decorative scroll work, was being managed by an asymmetric hold that was going to fail. She knew this, the way she knew dosages and herb interactions, and the sound of a chest that was not clearing correctly. She knew it before it happened, in the 2 seconds before the bracket tilted, and the torch caught the edge of the hanging tapestry, and the servant grabbed for it, and his hand came down on the lit torch head. The sound he made was not loud, a short, sharp intake of breath. Lyra was already moving. She was across the floor and up the 2 steps and had his hand in hers, before she had consciously decided to do any of it, the body doing what the body knew, her fingers wrapping around his wrist to keep the burned hand still, and her eyes on the burn. 2nd degree, the inside of 3 fingers, painful but clean, no charring. before the surrounding court officials had finished turning toward the sound. She was aware, in the specific way of someone whose conscious mind had just caught up with their body, that the court had gone silent. She was aware, in the more specific way of someone who had just remembered she was not supposed to be a healer, that she was crouched on the ceremonial dais holding a servant's burned hand, with the focused competence of someone who did this every day. She looked up. Sorath was watching her from 2 feet away. He had moved without her noticing, or rather she had been too occupied to notice, which was itself information about how completely she had left the performance behind. He was standing at the edge of the dais, looking at her with the amber eyes and the expression she had not been able to read when she arrived. She could read it now. It was not surprise. It was not the recalibrating assessment of Crescian's micro-expression. It was something older and quieter than both of those. The expression of something that had been waiting a very long time for a particular thing and had just watched it arrive without announcement. She looked back down at the servant's hand. "Third finger worst affected," she said to Sepha, who had appeared at her shoulder with the particular loyalty of someone who had decided to be useful in a crisis. "Cold water first, then I need—" She stopped. She did not have her kit. She had left her kit in the carriage because Mira did not have a healer's kit. She had nothing. She looked back up at Sorath. "Tell me you have a healer in this court," she said. The words came out of her mouth in her own voice, her actual voice, the voice she used when a situation was urgent, and performance was a luxury she could not afford. Not Mira's measured softness. Her own. The corner of Sorath's mouth moved. "We have several," he said. His voice had the same quality as the pressure change, something her body registered before her mind. "I'll have one called." "Good," she said. "And cold water now, please, before the tissue sets." He looked at her for one more moment with that expression she was still cataloguing. Then he turned and spoke to the court, and the court moved, and the servant got his cold water, and Lyra kept his hand steady and calm, and breathed in her own way, the quick, focused breath of a woman who had a reason to be urgent, and did not think about what she had just done until several minutes later, when the court healer had arrived and taken over, and she was standing at the edge of the dais with her borrowed composure in pieces around her feet. She had been here for less than 1 hour. She looked at her hands, the healer's hands, with their burn scar and their calluses and their roughened knuckles extending from Mira's embroidered cuffs. Across the room, Crescian was writing in his record book. Across the room, Sorath was watching her with the expression she had not had a category for until 5 minutes ago, and now had one for, and was not entirely sure what to do with. She folded her hands. She breathed in Mira's way. She was fairly certain it was already too late for that. The court had a rhythm, and Lyra spent the first week learning it the way she learned everything, by observation, by pattern recognition, by the accumulation of small data points into a picture she could navigate. The rhythm was formal in the mornings. When the administrative business of the empire moved through the audience chambers in the careful choreography of officials and petitioners, and the endless documentation of a territory that had been governed continuously for longer than most kingdoms had existed. It loosened in the afternoons, when the court dispersed into its various functions: the library, the practice grounds, the trade offices, the long gallery where the empire's history was recorded, in murals that Lyra had spent 2 afternoons studying, with the focused attention of someone who understood that history was often diagnosis. And in the evenings, the court gathered for the meal and the formal conversation and the particular social performance of people who lived in close proximity to great power and had organized themselves around that proximity. She was supposed to occupy the afternoons decoratively, and that was what the court expected of a tribute bride. A graceful presence, a political symbol, an ornament to the emperor's court that also served as a reminder of the arrangement between the empire and Sarathi. She was supposed to move through the court's afternoon loosening with Mira's stillness and Mira's grace, and the particular quality of noble visibility that communicated presence without demanding attention. She managed it for approximately 2 afternoons. On the third afternoon, she was in the long gallery studying the 3rd century murals when she heard the raised voice from the adjoining treatment room. Not loud, just tense. The specific tension of a medical disagreement conducted at a volume the participants believed was private. She knew the tone. She had used it herself once in a Sarathi court chamber and knew what it cost. She told herself to keep walking. She kept walking for approximately 4 steps. The treatment room door was ajar. Through it, she could see the court's senior physician, a careful man in his 60s she had observed twice already, competent in the Sarathi tradition, trained in methods she recognized, administering a compound to a court official who was seated and pale, and clearly had been pale for longer than today. The physician was preparing a second measure of the compound, and the first had already been administered, and the dosage of the first was already too high for a man of that body weight and that particular pallor, and the second was going to push it into a range that was going to cause secondary problems that would then need their own compounds, and the whole thing would spiral in the specific way of treatments that addressed symptoms without understanding causes. She pushed the door open. The physician looked up. The official looked up. Both of them had the expression of people whose private space had been entered without invitation. "The compound you're using," Lyra said, moving into the room because she was already in the room, and stopping halfway seemed worse than continuing, "is correct for the presenting symptoms. But he's showing secondary hepatic stress." She nodded at the official's eyes, which had the very slight yellowish cast that most people missed, and she never did, which means the standard dosage is going to compound the problem rather than resolve it. You'd want to halve it and add a supporting herb to the secondary measure. Milk thistle if you have it. Yellow dock if you don't. The physician looked at her for a long moment. He was not angry. She had half expected anger. The defensive reaction of a trained professional being corrected by a woman who was supposed to be decorating the gallery next door. What she saw instead was the expression of a man looking at something unexpected and deciding how to respond to it. "You're the tribute bride," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not entirely true but was what the situation required. He looked at his compound. He looked at the official's eyes. He set the second measure down. "Do you have training?" he said carefully. "Some," she said, which was the most careful answer available. He picked up the milk thistle from his shelf. He had it, well stocked, she noted with the approval of someone who valued a well-stocked shelf, and began adjusting the measure. She watched him do it and did not offer further comment because she had already offered what the situation required, and additional commentary would have been about her rather than the patient. She left the treatment room and returned to the gallery and stood in front of the 4th century murals and looked at them without seeing them for a moment. Saifa appeared at her elbow with the silent efficiency she had displayed in every crisis so far. "That's twice in 3 days," she said. "I know," Lyra said. "The first time was coincidence. That was performance failure. This was—" She stopped. "This was habit," she said. "I couldn't leave it." Saifa said nothing. She had the wisdom of a 20-year-old who had decided to be useful, rather than judgmental. Lyra looked at her own hands. She folded them. She breathed in Mira's way. She went back to studying the murals with the patient deliberateness of someone performing studiousness. and if her eyes kept moving to the treatment room door at intervals, she chose not to examine too carefully. That was information she was filing, rather than acting on. The Emperor's personal guard was named Braille. She knew this because he was always at the outer door of whatever room Sorath occupied, and she had been in and out of a variety of those rooms in the 10 days since her arrival, and on her third passage past him, she had noticed the way he held his left arm at the elbow when he was at ease. The arm perfectly still, the rest of him in the easy stance of a man doing his job, but the arm fractionally guarded, fractionally close to the body, the holding pattern of someone managing a low-grade pain they had decided not to acknowledge. She said nothing the first time, or the second. On the fourth passage she stopped. He looked at her with the neutral wariness of a guard who has been stopped unexpectedly. "How long has the shoulder been wrong?" she said. A pause. Then, "I don't know what you mean." "The way you hold your arm when you're resting your weight," she said. "It's been compensating for something for long enough that you don't notice you're doing it anymore." She looked at the arm. The original injury is in the shoulder joint, but the compensation has pulled the surrounding musculature in 3 different directions, and now you have a secondary problem in the neck and a tertiary one in your lower back that you probably think is unrelated. Braille looked at her for a long moment. He was a large man, the kind of large that came from actual use, built along similar lines to the Empire's architecture. His expression had started wary and moved through several things, and arrived somewhere in the vicinity of cautious interest. "How do you know that?" he said. "Lucky guess," she said, which was not true. He was quiet for a moment. "It's been wrong for about 2 years," he said. "Old injury." "The court physician says it's healed." "The original injury has healed," she said. "The compensation pattern it created hasn't." She looked at his arm. "Why, there's a specific manipulation that would help the neck and a set of exercises for the surrounding musculature. It won't fix everything, but it would get you back about 30% of the range you've lost." She paused. "If you wanted." Braille looked at his arm, then at her, then at the door behind him. "After my shift," he said. She nodded and walked on, and did not let herself think about the fact that she had just offered to treat the Dragon Emperor's head guard in her spare time, and that every one of these moments was another thread pulled loose from the performance she was supposed to be maintaining. She thought about it later, at length, in the privacy of the chamber she had been given, large, warm-toned, the amber light of the Empire's particular quality coming through windows that looked out over the dark mountain forest. She sat on the edge of the wide bed and looked at her hands and catalogued what she had done in 10 days. The servant's burn on the first night, the court physician's patient on the 3rd day, the kitchen servant with the hand tremor she had identified the cause of on the 5th day. A mineral deficiency, simple to address. She had left a note with the kitchens suggesting a dietary adjustment, and had not identified herself in the note because she was genuinely trying, to keep the threads from unraveling further. Braelle's shoulder, and the evenings in Sorath's study. Those were the things she was least able to categorize and most unable to stop. It had begun the 2nd night, which she had not expected. She had expected the formal distance of a being who collected tribute brides for political purposes, and had no particular interest in their inner lives. She had prepared for that, had prepared, in fact, to be ornamental and peripheral, and to use the periphery to observe and understand the court she now inhabited. She had not prepared for a knock at her chamber door on the 2nd evening, and Sorath, standing in the corridor with the same quality of presence he carried everywhere, and the simple, direct question, "Would you walk with me?" She had walked with him. They had ended in his private study, Not the formal audience rooms, but a working room, practical and book-heavy, and with the quality of a space that was actually used rather than arranged. He had asked about Sarathi. She had answered in Mira's version of Sarathi, the noble house, the father, the formal education. And then he had asked something she had not prepared an answer for. He had said, "What do you find interesting?" Not what do you enjoy, not what are your accomplishments, not the questions that were really requests for a performance of suitable attributes. What do you find interesting? As though the answer mattered for its own sake. She had answered him as Mira for approximately 30 seconds, and then she had answered him as herself, because the question had found the place where she lived, and Mira did not live there, and there was nobody home to answer in Mira's voice. She had told him about the body's systems, the way they were not separate but continuous, the way the liver talked to the blood, talked to the muscles, talked to the mind, the way every symptom was a communication from one part of the system to another, and the healer's job was translation. She had told him about the patterns she had learned to read, the micro-expressions of a body under stress, the way illness announced itself long before it was legible to most observers. She had talked for longer than she had talked to anyone about anything in 2 years, and when she stopped, she found him looking at her with the amber eyes and the expression that she did not yet have a name for. "That's not what a nobleman's daughter in Sarathi learns," he said. She had recovered herself enough to say, "I had an unusual education." He had looked at her for a moment. Then he had moved the conversation elsewhere, smoothly and without pressure. The way he did everything, not pushing the thread she had just offered, but not dropping it either. Filing it. She had gone back to her chamber that night and sat on the edge of the bed and understood, with the clarity of a woman who believed in evidence, that she was in significant difficulty. The evenings continued. Every second or third night, the knock at her door, the walk, the study, the fire, the conversation that kept finding the place where she lived, despite her efforts to redirect it. He asked about the cases she had observed in the court, carefully phrased, as though he had noticed her noticing, and was curious about what she had seen. She answered carefully, generally, without claiming the expertise the answers implied. He told her about the empire's history, not the formal version in the murals, but the underneath of it. The decisions that had shaped the territory over 2 centuries, the mistakes he had made, and what they had cost. The things he had learned about governance that no amount of inherited wisdom could have taught without the weight of actual consequence. He spoke about these things with the flat honesty of someone who had processed them long enough that they no longer required protection. She had never heard anyone in power speak about their mistakes that way, without the defensive architecture of justification. Just, I was wrong, and this is what it cost, and this is what I know now. She told him about the prince. Not the whole truth, not yet. The version where a court healer had observed something and reported it and had been dismissed. She told him the prince had died. She told him the truth had cost her position and her credentials, and the truth had changed nothing. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "The people who dismissed you, were they afraid you were wrong or afraid you were right?" She looked at him across the fire. "Afraid I was right," she said. "That I was right was the problem." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he already knew about the way certain courts operated and found it as predictable as weather. She went back to her chamber that night and did not sleep for some time, and thought about a man who asked the right question, without needing the answer, explained to him, and about Mira's name hanging between them like something fragile, and about the specific and particular torture of wanting to be known by someone you were lying to. She thought about what happened when the threads all came loose. She thought about this for longer than she could afford. On the 14th day, she was coming out of the library when she saw Cressian in the corridor ahead of her, standing at the far end with his record book open, writing something with the focused deliberateness of a man who had found what he was looking for. He looked up when she rounded the corner. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular hallway at this particular time, and had arrived early to be sure he did not miss it. He smiled. It was a small, careful smile, the smile of a man performing warmth for an audience of one. "Good evening," he said. "My Lady Mira." "Good evening," she said. She kept walking. She felt his gaze on her back the same way she had felt it at the arrival. The hand between the shoulder blades, the attention of a man who was building something and had just added another piece. She went to her chamber and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands and thought, with the clear, cold logic of a woman who had been through the moment where the truth became impossible to contain, that she was running out of time. She knew it was coming the way she had known about the servant's burn, not from a single piece of evidence, but from the accumulation of small observations that added up to a pattern she could read before it completed itself. Cressian had been thorough. She could see the thoroughness in the small ways he arranged himself near her at court functions, never obviously, never the watching that called attention to itself, but the positioned watching of a man who was confirming rather than discovering. He already had what he needed. She understood that from the corridor encounter. The record book was not for gathering. It was for organizing what had already been gathered into the sequence that would land hardest. She had 12 days, she estimated, maybe 14. She spent them doing what she had always done when a situation was progressing toward an outcome she could not prevent. She worked. She worked in the mornings at the court physician's side, which had become a quiet and unremarked arrangement after the treatment room incident. He had come to her chamber the following day with a case file and a question, and she had answered the question, and he had come back the day after with another one. And by the end of the first week, they had a routine that neither of them had named. She worked in the afternoons in whatever form the day required, the library, the gallery, on Braille's shoulder, which was genuinely improving, the kitchen servant's dietary adjustment, which she monitored without appearing to monitor. And in the evenings, she went to the study because she could not make herself stop going to the study. The study had become the most dangerous place in the court, and she went to it every time he asked because she had made, somewhere in the second week, a decision she had not acknowledged making until she was already inside it. That whatever happened with Cressian's record book, and the court, and the formal consequences of being exactly who she was going to have these evenings. She was going to have the conversations and the fire, and the amber eyes that found the place where she lived, and asked it questions, and listened to the answers with 2 centuries of patience. She was going to have this for as long as it was available, and then she was going to lose it the same way she had lost everything else true in her life, and she was going to survive that too. This was not hope. She was careful to distinguish it from hope. It was simply the decision to be present in what was real while it was real, because she had spent 2 years being absent from her own life, and she was not doing that anymore. She told him more about the prince on the 16th night. Not everything, not her name, not the specifics that would identify her beyond the shape of the story, but more than before. The poison in the evening tonic, the specific compound, the dosage pattern, the way it had been disguised in the base formula so that a physician not looking for it would not find it. She told him how she had found it, the accumulation of observations, the pattern that had no other explanation, the certainty she had carried to the king. Zorath listened with the quality of attention he brought to everything she said, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked, "How did you know? Before you had proof? How did you know?" She thought about how to answer that. "The body communicates," she said finally. "Everything is connected, and the connections have a logic to them, and when something in the pattern is wrong, the wrongness propagates. The prince's deterioration had the logic of something introduced rather than something generated. The system was responding to an external factor. She paused. You learned to read the difference. What did the poison do? He said. She told him, the compound, the mechanism, the timeline. She explained it the way she explained medical facts, precisely and without drama, because precision was respect, and drama was noise. She explained what it would have looked like to someone not looking for it, and why it had passed as fever. Sorath looked at the fire for a moment, then, whoever prescribed the evening tonic had access to the compound and understanding of the dosage. Yes, she said, and this person is still in their position. As far as I know, she said. He was quiet for a longer moment. The fire moved between them, and the amber light of the study held them both, and she looked at his profile and thought about how much of herself she had laid down in this room over these weeks, piece by piece, without meaning to, without being able to stop. The truth is a specific kind of courage, he said. Not the courage of action, the courage of consequence. Knowing what the telling will cost, and telling it anyway. He looked at her. That is rarer than most people understand. She looked at the fire. It didn't change anything, she said. The truth didn't change anything. It changed you, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she had been cataloging since the first night, and had finally, 3 days ago, found a category for. It was the expression of someone who had been waiting for something for a very long time, and had found it in an unexpected form, and was being careful not to move too quickly in case the form startled. She looked back at the fire because looking at him had become a thing she needed to ration. She went back to her chamber that night and sat on the edge of the bed and thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who had made a decision and was now examining its cost, that she was not going to be able to leave this the way she had left other things. The 2 years of careful emotional economy, the practice of wanting nothing that could be taken, the self-sufficiency she had built out of the rubble of being right at too high a price, all of it had developed in 3 weeks of evenings in a study with an amber-eyed being who asked the right questions, a structural weakness she had not anticipated. She was in love with him. She noted this the way she noted diagnoses, with the flat accuracy of someone who believed in naming things correctly, even when the name was inconvenient. She was in love with Sorath, the Dragon Emperor, who believed her name was Mira, who had no idea that the woman he had been talking to for 3 weeks was a disgraced healer from Sorathi's lower court, whose credentials had been revoked for telling the truth about a murdered prince. She set this aside and went to sleep because there was nothing to be done with it tonight. The formal court session was called on the 19th day. Cressian announced it the morning prior. A standard administrative session, he said, in with several matters requiring the full court's attention. His voice had the quality of a man reciting a description he had composed carefully. Standard administrative session. Several matters. She knew. She dressed in Mira's blue gown, the traveling gown, the first one, because it was the one that fit best, and she had stopped having opinions about what she wore 3 weeks ago when the performance had become too thin to support that level of detail. She did Mira's hair herself. Sifa, having silently and efficiently stepped in to help with the parts she could not reach. Sifa had known for at least a week that the end of the road was approaching and had not said so, and Lyra had not said so, and they had continued in the productive silence of 2 people who understood each other without needing to perform the understanding. You could tell him first, Sifa said, setting the last pin. Lyra looked at herself in the mirror. She looked like Mira, approximately. She had always looked like Mira, approximately. And the approximation had been enough for 3 weeks, and it was ending today. "No," she said. Sepha looked at her in the mirror. "Why not?" "Because then it becomes about whether he forgives me before the court sees it," she said. "And I don't want to ask him for that." She met Sepha's eyes in the glass. "Whatever happens today happens in the open. I'm not managing the exit." Sepha was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the particular respect of a 20-year-old who had decided the woman she was looking at was someone worth her loyalty. They went to the court session. The full court assembled in the great audience chamber, the largest room in the court complex, the one Lyra had entered on the first night for the tribute arrival, with the high ceilings and the amber dimness, and the dark, polished floors. The court officials arranged along the sides, the senior administrators at the central table. The tribute bride positioned in the formal standing place near the front, where political symbols were positioned. She stood in the formal place and folded her hands and looked at the front of the room where Sorath sat in the position she had never seen him occupy before, not the working posture of the study or the walking posture of the gallery, but the settled authority of a ruler in the formal seat, the full weight of 2 centuries in the quality of his stillness. He looked at her when she entered. His expression was what it always was, settled, unreadable in the way that was not absence, but containment. Crescian stepped forward. He was impeccable. She gave him that. The organization of his presentation was the work of a man who had been thorough and had taken his time, and had sequenced the information in the order that would be most effective. He began with the official record. The tribute arrangement between Sarathi and the Empire, the terms, the family designated to provide the tribute bride, the name. Lady Mira of House Sarathi, he said. Second daughter of Lord Aldrich Sarathi, aged 23, education at the Sarathi Court School. No formal training in medicine or healing arts. He paused. The pause was precisely long enough. The woman present in this court, he continued, is not Lady Mira of House Sarathi. The room shifted. She felt it around her, the intake of breath, the small movements of people recalibrating, the specific energy of a court receiving a significant piece of information. She stood still. She kept her hands folded. She breathed. Crescian continued. He was thorough. He had the family records, the real Mira, her age, her description, the formal portrait that matched neither of them exactly. He had the substitution logic. Same family, similar coloring. The portrait old enough to allow confusion. He had her real name. He said it. Lyra of House Sarathi, eldest daughter. Formerly credentialed as a junior court healer under the Sarathi Medical Registry. He said formerly with a specific weight. Formerly, he continued, because the credentials were revoked 2 years ago, following an investigation into conduct unbecoming a court official. He read from the Sarathi court record. She recognized the language, had heard it before, had been present when it was written. The accusations, the finding, the formal revocation. He read it in the flat voice of a man presenting evidence, and the flat voice made it worse, gave it the quality of simple fact, the quality of something that did not require interpretation, because interpretation would only complicate the obvious. He set the record down. The woman sent to this court, he said, is not the promised tribute bride. She is a fraud and a substitute, sent in the place of the designated representative, whose identity she has misrepresented for 19 days. He looked at the court, and then at Sorath. This is an insult to the Emperor's court, and a violation of the tribute arrangement. The political implications, he kept talking. She stopped listening to the words and listened instead to the room, the quality of the court's reaction, the particular character of an audience that had been given permission to be outraged and was deciding how much outrage to spend. Some faces showed it. Others showed the more complicated expression of people who had watched her in the court for 3 weeks and were recalculating what they had seen. She looked at Sorath. His face was what it always was. The stillness, the containment. Amber eyes on Cressian while he spoke, and then, briefly, on her, and then back to Cressian. She could not read him. In 3 weeks she had learned to read most of what moved across his face, and this was the one moment she could not read. And it was, she understood, the most important one. Cressian finished. He stepped back with the composed satisfaction of a man who had done precise and thorough work, and was confident in the result. The room waited. Lyra unfolded her hands. She did not defend the deception. There was no defense for the deception that was not an excuse, and she did not make excuses. She did not explain the reasons, Mira's panic, the engagement, and the nothing she had left in Sarathi, because the reasons were her business and not the court's, and she was not going to perform contrition for an audience she had not chosen. She said 3 things. She said, "I came to this court in my sister's name because she asked me to, and I had nothing left in Sarathi to stay for." She said, "Everything I have told anyone in this court in 19 days is true." She said, "The Prince of Sarathi was poisoned. I found the evidence, and I reported it, and the man I reported it to was the man who poisoned him, and the king believed the poisoner over me, and the prince died anyway." She paused. "That is what happened. That is who I am." She looked at the court, and then at Sorath across the room. "The deception of my name was real. Everything else I have been in this court was not a performance." She stopped. She had nothing else. She stood in the middle of the court chamber in Mira's blue gown, with her healer's hands visible at her sides, and she was what she was, disgraced and honest, and tired of the cost of honesty, and constitutionally unable to stop paying it. She looked at Sorath. He was looking at her. The room was completely quiet. She had been here before. Not in this room, not with these people, but in this moment, the moment after the true thing had been said, and the space before the verdict arrived. She had stood in a Sarathi court chamber with the evidence in her hands, and the king's face closing against her, and she knew the quality of this silence and what it usually preceded. She braced herself for it the way she had braced herself before, and been right before and survived before. Sorath stood up. The room reorganized itself around his standing, the way it always did. The instinctive, collective attention of a court that had learned over years of proximity that when this particular being chose to move, it was worth being still for. He stood at the formal seat with the full weight of his presence, and he looked at Lyra, and he said, "I have a question for you." His voice was what it always was, low even, carrying without effort, the voice that had no performance in it. The room waited. He said, "If you had the prince's case in front of you again, the same evidence, the same court, the same certain cost, what would you do?" The question landed in the chamber, and she felt the room receive it, felt the slight collective confusion of an audience that had been expecting a verdict and had received instead a question directed at the person on trial. And she understood what he was doing, and she answered him from the place where she kept the things she was most certain of. "The same thing," she said. She said it without pause, without the performance of deliberation, because there was nothing to deliberate. She had made this choice at 22 years old in a Sarathi court chamber with everything on the line, and she had been living inside the consequences for 2 years, and she would make it again in the morning, if the morning required it. Sorath looked at her for a moment with the expression she had spent 3 weeks cataloguing and had finally named correctly. Then he looked at the court. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. She had been in this court for 19 days, and she had not once heard him raise it, and she understood now that the voice he used was the same at every volume because the thing it carried did not require volume to land. He said, "I have been receiving tribute brides from Sarathi and 6 other kingdoms for 50 years. The court was still. He said, "In 50 years, I have met women who were accomplished, and women who were beautiful, and women who had been prepared with great care to be whatever they calculated I required." He paused. Every one of them arrived performing a version of herself built for my consumption. He said it without condemnation, the flat observation of a being recording what he had seen. I have sent every one of them back because I could not find in any of them a single unmanaged moment of genuine self. He looked at the court. I had begun to conclude that what I was looking for did not exist. He turned slightly toward Cressian. "You have presented this woman's deception as an insult to this court," he said. "I understand the argument. The tribute arrangement was not honored in its technical terms." He paused. "But I would ask you to consider what was honored instead." Cressian's expression had begun its recalibration. She recognized the quality of it, the same structural problem developing that she had seen on Petra's face in the Ashvin longhouse, the same experience of watching a building lose a load-bearing element. He said, "In 19 days, this woman corrected a medication error that would have caused secondary organ stress in a senior court official. She identified and began treating a musculoskeletal compensation pattern in my head guard that your court physicians had documented as resolved. She provided dietary guidance to 3 kitchen staff members whose conditions were being managed symptomatically rather than causally." He looked at Cressian. She did all of this while attempting to perform a role that required her to do none of it. The performance kept failing because she kept encountering problems she could not leave unsolved. He looked at the court. He said, "I have spent 50 years receiving women who performed perfectly and had nothing underneath the performance." He said, "What arrived in this court 19 days ago performed imperfectly and had, underneath the imperfect performance, more substance than anything I have encountered in 2 centuries. He turned back to Lyra. She stood in the center of the chamber in Mira's blue gown and looked at him across the formal space and felt the thing she had decided not to call hope, doing something in her chest that she was running out of names for. He said, "The Prince of Sarathi was poisoned, and you were right, and it cost you everything, and you would do it again." He said it back to her with the same flat accuracy she had used, and she heard in it something she had not heard anywhere in 2 years. The simple recognition of someone receiving a true thing and knowing it was true without needing it, explained or defended or softened. He said, "You are exactly what I have been looking for." The room was completely quiet. He looked at Cressian. He said, "The tribute arrangement between this court and Sarathi will be renegotiated. The terms as they stand are 50 years old and reflect a political logic that is 50 years out of date." He said it with the calm of a man closing a chapter he had been meaning to close. "That is not a consequence of this situation. It is something I should have done 20 years ago." Cressian looked at his record book, then at Sorath, then at the record book again. He had the expression of a man watching the architecture he had built over decades being redesignated for a different purpose, not demolished, just no longer his role, Sorath said, will be restructured to reflect the administrative priorities of the current court. His oversight of the tribute arrangements ends today. Aldrich will draft the formal restructuring notice. He said it the way he said everything, without heat, without the performance of anger, and just the settled certainty of a decision made by a being who had been making decisions for 2 centuries and had learned that the correct decision stated plainly was more final than the dramatic one. Crescent bowed. It was a precise and correct bow, and his face gave nothing away, and she understood from this that he was a man of genuine professional discipline, and that the discipline would carry him through this moment, even though the moment had removed something significant from him. She almost respected it. The court was dismissed. She stood in the emptying chamber and watched the officials file out and felt the specific quality of aftermath. The silence, after a thing that had been building for a long time, finally arrived and resolved, and left the air with a different texture than it had before. She had felt this in Sarathi, in the court chamber, when the king had given his verdict. The texture then had been cold. This was different. This was the particular quality of a silence that had warmth somewhere in it, and she did not know yet what to do with warmth in this specific form. Sorath crossed the chamber to her, not quickly. At the pace of a being who had decided where he was going and saw no reason to hurry. He stopped in front of her, closer than the formal distance of the tribute arrangement, the distance of something that was no longer the tribute arrangement. She looked up at him. He looked at her with the expression that was not the patience of someone waiting for something to arrive. It was the expression of a man who was already inside the thing he had been waiting for, and was taking his time inside it. She said, "When did you know?" "The first night," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. The first night. The servants' burn, the assessment, the cold water please before the tissue sets in her own voice in this court, with its high ceilings. 20 minutes into the performance. "I was terrible at it from the beginning," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "You were," he said, in the tone of someone confirming a fact they found genuinely endearing, rather than troubling. She looked at him. "And you said nothing?" "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The same quality of considering she had learned over 3 weeks. Not hesitation. The choice of the precise word. "Because," he said, "whoever you actually were, you were the first person to arrive in this court in 50 years whose performance kept failing because the person underneath it was more present than the performance." He looked at her face. "I had spent 50 years watching women perform. When I found someone who couldn't maintain it for 20 minutes, I was not going to interrupt it." She thought about all the evenings in the study, all the threads she had pulled loose without meaning to, on all the moments where Mira had receded, and she had simply been there, herself, answering the questions with the answers that lived where she actually lived. She thought about the torture of it, the genuine connection, and the false foundation. And then she thought about the other side of it, the thing she had not let herself consider. He had known. He had known since the first night, and he had not exposed her, and he had not pushed her, and he had asked her the right questions and waited for the real answers. And in the study by the fire, he had been talking to her, not to Mira. He had been talking to her the entire time. She felt something in her chest complete itself. The structural thing, the thing that had been held in compression for 2 years and had been slowly, over 19 days of evenings, in a warm study, releasing. She felt it release the rest of the way, not with drama, with the quiet completeness of a thing that had found its position. She said, "I need you to know that I am not easy." She said it the way she said things that were important, precisely, without softening. "I have strong opinions about medical practice, and I will not keep them to myself when I see something wrong. I have been told I am difficult. I was told that before the prince and I was told it after, and both times by people who meant that I would not perform agreement when I disagreed, and I won't." She looked at him. "I will tell you when I think you are wrong." "Good," he said. His voice held no reservation. the flat certainty she had heard when he said, "You are exactly what I have been looking for." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "And you should know that the woman you have been talking to for 3 weeks is exactly who I am. Not better. Not adjusted for your benefit. That is simply what I am, and it does not improve from here." "I know," he said. His eyes were warm with the specific warmth that had nothing to do with the court's ambient light. "That is what I wanted." She reached out and put her hand in his. He looked down at it, her healer's hand, the burn scar on the index finger, at the calluses across the palm, the roughened knuckles of someone who had been washing their hands in medicinal solution since they were 12 years old. He looked at it the way she had learned he looked at everything real, with the full quality of his attention, nothing skimmed. He raised it and held it with both of his, the warmth of him moving through her from the point of contact outward, and she felt the mate bond taking its first tentative shape between them. Not the sudden claiming of a court ceremony, but the slower thing, the thing that built from genuine knowledge of another person and could not be rushed or manufactured or mistaken for something else. The claiming happened 3 days later. Not in the formal court. In the study, in the evening, in the specific ordinary intimacy of a room that had become the most important room in the most important territory she had ever entered. No ceremony, no choreography, no performance for an audience. He asked her, and she said yes from the place where she kept her most certain things, and the bond completed itself in the warmth of the study, with the fire burning, and her hand in his, and the amber light, doing what it always did in this territory, holding everything in a warmth that felt like something the air itself had decided to offer. She did not feel claimed in the diminishing sense. She felt, for the first time since a Sarathi court chamber had taken apart everything she had built, that the truth she carried had found somewhere to be that did not punish her for carrying it. 1 year later, a letter arrived from Sarathi. Lyra was in the court's medical hall, her hall now, her name in the registry, her organization on the shelves, and her careful labels on every pot and bundle, the best supplied medical facility in any court she had ever seen, because she had spent a year making it so, with the resources of an empire and the authority of an appointment that made her Sarathi credentials not restored, but made irrelevant, superseded by something larger than the court that had revoked them. The letter was brought to her by a Sarathi courier who had traveled 12 days over the mountain pass and who looked at the medical hall and at Lyra in her working clothes at the head physician's bench, and then at the door behind her, where the Dragon Emperor's cipher was carved into the lintel and recalibrated something in his understanding of what he had traveled 12 days to deliver. She opened it. She read it, standing at the bench, because sitting down for correspondence was a habit she had never acquired. The head royal physician of Sarathi had been removed from his position. Evidence had been found. Someone finally with the specific knowledge to look for it had looked and found it. And the Sarathi court was in the process of formal proceedings. The king was writing to request the consultation of the empire's head physician on the matter of the original evidence, the compounds, the mechanism. The king wished to know if the empire's physician would be willing to review the case. She read the letter twice. She set it down on the bench beside the compound she had been preparing. She heard the footstep in the doorway and knew it without looking. She looked anyway. Sorath stood in the doorway of her medical hall in the dark working clothes he wore when he was moving through the court, rather than presiding over it, hands in his pockets, Inai watching her face with the expression she had stopped trying to catalogue a year ago, and had simply started receiving. His eyes moved to the letter on the bench, then to her face. She looked at the letter. She thought about the prince. She thought about 22 years old and certain, and the king's face closing against her, and the prince dying anyway, and the 2 years of careful diminished surviving that had followed. She thought about the head physician who had been in his position for 12 more months than he should have been, and the additional harm that had been done in those 12 months by a man who had never faced a consequence for what he had done the first time. She thought about the truth being a specific kind of courage. She looked up. She said, "Tell them I'm busy." Sorath looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not the contained version. Not the almost smile she had catalogued in the earliest days, or the real smile she had learned over months of evenings in the study. Something fuller than either of those. The smile of a being 200 years old who had spent a very long time waiting for something real, and had found it, and was, 1 year into finding it, still finding it. She looked at his face in the warm amber light of her medical hall, her name on the door, her work on every shelf, and she felt, yet without qualification, without the bracing, without the practiced anticipation of loss that had been her default setting for 2 years before this, simply and entirely glad. She picked up her compound. She returned to work. The letter from Sarathi sat on the bench beside her, and the Empire's head physician prepared her morning compounds in the hall she had built, and the Dragon Emperor stood in her doorway with that expression on his face. And the amber light held them both in the warmth it had always offered this territory, unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world, which, she supposed, it did.